They thought humanity was broken, but the galaxy had never seen what we were hiding. The council chamber hung suspended in the void between stars, a monument to galactic unity that had endured for 3,000 years. Representatives from 47 civilizations gathered in its crystalline halls, their forms as varied as the worlds they represented, some floating in containment fields, others standing on limbs that defied simple counting, a few existing as pure energy given temporary shape. For centuries, they had debated, negotiated, and maintained the fragile peace that held their corner of the universe together. But today, the chamber felt different. Today, fear had replaced diplomacy. At the center of it all stood the human delegation, and they were not what anyone expected. The ambassador did not wear the flowing robes of reconciliation that humans had displayed for the past 50 years. Instead, she stood in stark black and silver, her posture rigid as forged steel, her eyes carrying the weight of 1,000,000,000 graves. Behind her, the commander waited in silence, his weathered face telling stories of battles the galaxy believed humanity had forgotten. The council members shifted in their seats, appendages twitching with barely concealed anxiety. They had summoned Earth to answer for recent border incidents, expecting apologies and weakness. They had miscalculated catastrophically. The eldest speaker, a being whose species had witnessed the birth of stars, raised what might have been a hand for silence. The gesture was unnecessary. Every eye, sensor, and consciousness in the chamber was already fixed on the humans with an intensity that bordered on dread. Something had changed in the representatives, from that small blue world in the outer territories. Something that made even the most ancient and powerful civilizations remember what fear felt like. Humanity stands accused, the eldest speaker began, his translated voice echoing through 1,000 different methods of perception, of violating the Treaty of Endless Peace. Your vessels have been detected beyond your authorized zones. Your energy signatures appear in systems where no human should venture. Most troubling of all, your communications now carry encryption that our most advanced minds cannot penetrate. We demand explanation. We demand compliance. We demand. You demand nothing. The ambassador's voice cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. She had not raised her volume, had not moved from her position, yet somehow her words carried to every corner of the vast space. You seem to have forgotten what happened the last time someone made demands of Earth. The temperature in the chamber dropped. Not literally. Those several species registered the psychological shift as physical cold. The counselors remembered, of course. Everyone remembered. 50 years ago, when the Great Alliance had finally convinced humanity to abandon its military doctrines and embrace eternal peace, to dismantle its war fleets and dissolve its defense networks. 50 years of watching humans struggle with enemies they could no longer fight back against, of seeing human colonies raided by pirates they were forbidden to pursue, of witnessing the slow erosion of human dignity at the hands of civilizations who viewed the peace treaty as a leash rather than an accord. The galaxy had believed it was watching humanity die slowly, quietly, obediently. They had been so very wrong. The commander stepped forward now, and something about his movement made the assembled beings flinch. He moved like gravity itself had bent to accommodate his will, each step purposeful and measured. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the diplomatic polish of the ambassador. It carried something far more dangerous, truth. For 50 years, you watched us suffer, he said simply. You saw our people taken, our worlds threatened, our requests for justice denied because violence violated your precious peace. You believed we had become weak. You believed we had forgotten what we were. His smile held no warmth whatsoever. You believed peace was surrender. A holographic display materialized above the assembly, showing star charts that made several counselors gasp in recognition. Human vessels, hundreds of them, positioned in formations that spoke of strategic genius and technological advancement far beyond what the treaty allowed. Not scattered patrol boats or desperate defense platforms, but proper warships, the kind humanity had promised to never build again. The ambassador's voice took on an edge that could cut through armor plating. We tried your peace. We honored your treaties, while others did not. We watched our children die, while you debated the philosophical implications of allowing us to defend ourselves. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the chamber like a shroud. And while you debated, while you celebrated your peaceful utopia built on our suffering, we were preparing. The eldest speaker found his voice, though it trembled with something that might have been ancient rage or newfound terror. This is a violation of everything you forced upon us. The commander interrupted. Not everything we are. The chamber erupted in chaos, voices and signals and psychic emanations all demanding explanations, threatening sanctions, calling for immediate action. But beneath the panic, a darker question was forming in every mind present. If humanity could hide this, could rebuild in secret while appearing broken, could smile and nod while preparing for war, what else had they been hiding? The ambassador raised her hand, and silence fell like a guillotine blade. When she spoke again, her words would be transmitted to every world in the Alliance, repeated in every language known to civilization, remembered for generations as the moment everything changed. This is humanity's final message to the galaxy, she said, and now there was no hiding the steel beneath the silk, no concealing the predator behind the diplomat's mask. You wanted peace. We gave you peace. Now witness what happens when you mistake our restraint for weakness, our patience for surrender, our silence for acceptance. She leaned forward slightly, and every being in the chamber felt the weight of humanity's collective fury pressing down on them like the gravity of a collapsing star. We tried peace. Now you'll witness our retribution. But what the council didn't know, what nobody in that chamber could have guessed, was that humanity's the silence that followed the ambassador's declaration lasted exactly 7 seconds. In those 7 seconds, the most powerful civilizations in known space confronted a truth that shattered their fundamental understanding of reality. Humanity, the species they had pitted and controlled, had become something they could not comprehend. The overseer from the Kresh Dominion was the first to break. His species had ruled 3 sectors for millennia, their military might unquestioned until they too had joined the treaty. Now his crystalline form flickered with agitation as he accessed databases that suddenly seemed incomplete. Impossible, he transmitted, his thoughts bleeding into the shared consciousness network that connected the chamber. Our surveillance detected nothing. Our intelligence operatives reported complete compliance. Your military infrastructure was dismantled under our direct observation. The commander's laugh was quiet but somehow filled the entire chamber. It was the laugh of someone who had waited decades for this exact moment. Your operatives saw exactly what we wanted them to see. Your surveillance detected precisely what we allowed it to detect. He gestured, and the holographic display shifted, showing shipyards hidden in asteroid fields, research stations disguised as mining operations, entire fleets concealed in the shadow of gas giants. You thought you understood human deception because you had studied our history, but you studied the wrong lessons. The ambassador moved through the chamber now, her steps echoing despite the vast space being designed to absorb sound. Several counselors recoiled as she passed, their instincts screaming warnings their conscious minds had ignored for half a century. She stopped before a viewing port that showed the gathered fleet outside, hundreds of vessels from dozens of worlds, all believing themselves safe in neutral territory. 50 years ago, when you demanded we disarm, we had a choice to make, she said, her reflection ghosting over the stars beyond. We could refuse and face war with the entire alliance. We could comply and slowly die as a species. Or we could do what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds. She turned back to face them, and in her eyes burned something that made even the ancient beings present feel young and naive. We could adapt. The chief scientist, a being whose species had mastered quantum mechanics before humanity learned to make fire, accessed her computational implants frantically. The energy requirements alone would be impossible to hide. Our sensors sweep every system, every moon, every piece of space debris larger than a transport pod. The power signatures from construction of this magnitude would have been visible across half the sector. Would have been, the commander agreed, if we were using technology you understand. He nodded to the specialist, a younger human who had remained silent until now. The woman stepped forward, her hands moving through holographic controls that appeared at her touch. Tell them what we found. The specialist's voice was calm, almost academic, which somehow made her words more terrifying. 37 years ago, a human research team studying gravitational anomalies near the outer darkness made a discovery. We found something that shouldn't exist according to your physics, your mathematics, your understanding of reality. She paused, letting the data streams flow across every screen in the chamber. We found a way to manipulate gravity itself at the quantum level. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Half the counselors tried to access the data simultaneously, their various forms of consciousness crashing against encryption that bent the very concept of information security. The other half simply stared, understanding enough to be afraid even if they couldn't grasp the full implications. Gravity manipulation is theoretical, the eldest speaker said, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. Every species has attempted it. Every species has failed. The energy requirements alone would make it impossible using your methods, the ambassador interrupted. But you see, that was your first mistake. You assumed human scientists would follow the same paths you did. You assumed we thought about the universe the way you do. She smiled, and it was not a kind expression. You forgot that humanity spent millions of years as prey animals before we became predators. We learned to see patterns where none seemed to exist. We learned to find weaknesses in systems that appeared perfect. We learned to survive when survival itself seemed impossible. The holographic display showed something new now, something that made the assembled beings question their perception of reality. A human vessel, small by military standards, simply vanished from normal space. Not through hyperspace or wormhole technology, but through something else entirely. It reappeared inside the defensive perimeter of a heavily fortified station, fired a single shot through shields that should have been impenetrable, and vanished again before any countermeasure could activate. We call it phase shift technology, the specialist explained with the detached interest of someone describing a household appliance. By manipulating localized gravity wells, we can temporarily exist in a state where conventional matter cannot interact with us. Shields, armor, even the hulls of ships become meaningless. We can move through solid matter as if it were empty space. The implications crashed over the council like a tidal wave. Every defense system in the galaxy, every fortification, every safe zone and protected territory had just become as vulnerable as tissue paper. 50 years of peacetime complacency meant none of them had prepared for an enemy who could simply ignore their defenses. The admiral from the Confederation Navy, a grizzled veteran who had fought in the wars before the treaty, stood abruptly. His species was aquatic, his form floating in a containment sphere, but his posture radiated the universal language of military alarm. You're telling us you've had this capability for decades. You could have struck at any time, destroyed any target, killed any leader, and we would have been defenseless. Yes, the commander said simply. The single word carried the weight of countless operational plans, strategic assessments, and restrained violence. We could have ended you all 100 times over. We could have taken revenge for every insult, every casual cruelty, every human child who died while you debated whether they deserved protection. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, yet everyone heard it perfectly. But we didn't. Because unlike you, we actually believe in peace. The ambassador returned to her original position, standing before the assembled council with the bearing of someone who held all the cards and was deciding whether to show mercy. For 37 years, we held this power in secret. We watched you grow comfortable with our supposed weakness. We documented every violation of the treaty that others committed while you looked away, because it wasn't your people suffering. We built our strength in silence and waited. Waited for what? The eldest speaker asked, though part of him clearly didn't want to know the answer. For you to understand that peace is not the absence of strength, the ambassador replied. It's the choice to restrain it. We gave you 50 years of genuine peace. 50 years where we could have destroyed you but chose diplomacy instead. Now ask yourselves what you gave us in return. The overseer's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been anger or fear. This is blackmail. Terrorism. You threatened the entire galactic order with. We threaten nothing. The commander cut him off. We're simply informing you that the balance of power has shifted. You can no longer treat humanity as a convenient victim for your moral philosophy experiments. You can no longer ignore attacks on our people because defending them would complicate your ethical frameworks. The protection you forced us to abandon, we've rebuilt in ways you cannot counter. The chief scientist was still analyzing the data, her computational processes working faster than seemed physically possible. When she spoke, her voice carried the hollow tone of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. If what you're showing us is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, then you don't just have a military advantage. You've fundamentally broken the strategic paradigm that has governed galactic civilization for 3,000 years. Every doctrine, every defensive strategy, every assumption about warfare and deterrence has just become obsolete. Now you're beginning to understand, the ambassador said quietly. We didn't just build weapons. We changed the rules of the game itself. The Admiral pulled up tactical assessments that were already being flagged as obsolete by his own computers. How many vessels have this capability? How many of your people can operate this technology? The commander's smile was answer enough even before he spoke. You're asking the wrong questions. Yushul, the mediator from the Harmony Collective, finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotions her species rarely expressed. Her kind had evolved beyond physical conflict millions of years ago, ascending to a state of pure diplomatic consciousness. Violence was so foreign to her people that they literally could not conceive of it without artificial cognitive frameworks. Now those frameworks were straining under the weight of what humanity had revealed. Please, she transmitted, her thoughts carrying undertones of genuine desperation. Help us understand. If you possessed this power for so long, if you could have ended your suffering at any moment, why did you wait? Why allow your people to die when you had the means to save them? The ambassador's expression softened slightly, though the steel beneath never wavered. For the first time since entering the chamber, she looked less like a harbinger of war and more like someone who had carried an impossible burden for far too long. Because we hoped you would remember what justice meant. We hoped that eventually someone in this council would stand up and say that the treaty applied to everyone or it applied to no one. We hoped that our restraint would inspire yours. But we failed you, the eldest speaker said quietly, and for a being who had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, the admission seemed to age him further. We saw your suffering and called it the price of peace. We saw others violate the treaty and called it isolated incidents. We let you bleed because stopping it would have been inconvenient. The commander nodded slowly, acknowledgement without forgiveness. 743 colony ships attacked in 50 years. 32 settlements raided. 14,000 humans taken as slaves by the Torth marauders alone. And every time we brought evidence to this council, you debated protocol while our people screamed in chains. His voice never rose, never cracked, but each word landed like a physical blow. The marauders weren't even treaty signatories. You could have acted without violating your precious peace. But you didn't, because human suffering was easier to ignore than galactic politics. The representative from the Torth Collective, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably in his suspension field. His species were known for their pragmatic approach to resources, which was a diplomatic way of saying they viewed weaker civilizations as commodities. Those incidents were never proven to be state-sponsored actions. Independent raiders operating outside our... Save it, the specialist interrupted, her academic tone replaced with something sharp and cold. We know exactly who authorized those raids. We know which ships were used, which officials looked the other way, which bank accounts received the profits. For 37 years, while you thought we were helpless, we were watching, learning, recording. She pulled up financial records that made the representative's form flicker with alarm. We have evidence that would collapse your government overnight. Evidence your own people would find impossible to deny. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the implications became clear. Humanity hadn't just been building weapons in secret. They had been conducting intelligence operations on a scale that made the galaxy's most sophisticated spy networks look like children playing with toys. Every transaction, every communication, every hidden deal and backroom agreement had been observed, documented, and filed away for precisely this moment. The security director from a Central Alliance, whose job was to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration, accessed his threat assessment protocols and watched them immediately flag every human in the chamber as Category 0 threats, a classification that technically didn't exist because nothing was supposed to qualify for it. How deep does your network go? How many of our systems have you compromised? The ambassador glanced at the commander, and something passed between them. A shared memory, perhaps, or a decision long ago made, but only now revealed. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of secrets that had been kept at tremendous cost. When you forced us to dismantle our military, you didn't consider that soldiers don't stop being soldiers just because you take away their guns. We had millions of personnel with decades of training in intelligence, strategy, and warfare, so we gave them new jobs. The holographic display changed again, showing a web of connections that spanned the known galaxy. Human merchants whose trade routes touched every major civilization. Human researchers working in collaborative projects across dozens of species. Human diplomats, teachers, engineers, and artisans scattered throughout space. Each one appearing harmless and defeated. Each one feeding information back to Earth through channels so subtle that even the most paranoid security services had missed them. We became what you expected us to be, the commander explained. Humble, grateful for whatever scraps you allowed us, eager to integrate into your civilizations. And while you congratulated yourselves on civilizing the savage humans, we were learning your weaknesses, mapping your infrastructure, and preparing for the day when peace would finally fail. The tactical advisor to the council, a military mind who had reluctantly accepted a ceremonial position in the new era of peace, was pulling up strategic assessments with hands that shook slightly. His species had fought humans once, centuries ago, before first contact with the broader galactic community. They had learned respect for human adaptability the hard way. Now that old respect transformed into something closer to terror. The phase shift technology alone would give you tactical superiority in any direct conflict. Combined with comprehensive intelligence on our systems, you could strike at will with near impunity. But you're showing us all of this. Why reveal your advantages unless? He stopped mid-sentence as understanding crashed over him like ice water. Unless we want you to know, the ambassador finished for him. Unless the revelation itself is the weapon. The mediator's consciousness recoiled from the implication. You're trying to destabilize the alliance. You want us to turn on each other, to question who else might be compromised, to see enemies in every shadow. This is psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. Is it warfare if we're telling you the truth? The specialist asked with clinical precision. We're not spreading lies or manufacturing conflicts. We're simply showing you what already exists. The corruption that you ignored, the injustices you tolerated, the rot at the foundation of your perfect peace. If that destabilizes you, perhaps the problem isn't our honesty, but your denial. The overseer's form pulsed with barely contained rage. You speak of justice while threatening war. You claim moral superiority while admitting to decades of espionage and weapons development. You're no better than the civilizations you condemn. The commander moved so quickly that several species' perception couldn't track it. One moment he was standing beside the ambassador. The next he was directly in front of the overseer, close enough that the crystalline being's containment field distorted from proximity. When the commander spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the accumulated fury of 50 years of restraint. We watched our children die because you said fighting back would make us as bad as our attackers. We honored treaties that others violated freely because you said civilization required sacrifice. We bled for your philosophy while you remained comfortable and safe, judging us for daring to want survival. He stepped back slowly, giving the overseer space to breathe. Don't you dare lecture us about morality. We earned the right to judge you with every drop of human blood you decided was an acceptable price for your peace. The eldest speaker raised his hand again, seeking order in a chamber that was quickly dissolving into chaos. Enough. What do you want? You didn't reveal all of this simply to frighten us. You want something, or you're warning us about something worse. Which is it? The ambassador returned to the center of the chamber, and when she spoke, every being present felt the shift in the air. This was the moment everything had been building toward. This was why humanity had finally broken its silence. 3 days ago, a human colony in the outer reach was attacked. Not by raiders or pirates, but by a military strike force using weapons that violated every treaty in existence. 2,000 humans died in the first wave. The distress signal was transmitted to this council according to proper protocol. Emergency assistance was requested within the legal framework you established. She paused, letting the timeline sink in. 3 days. Not a single council vessel responded. Not one civilization sent aid. You let them die because the sector was disputed territory and intervention might create diplomatic complications. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of life support and atmospheric processing seemed to fade away. Every counselor present knew what was coming next, but was powerless to stop it. That colony was called Haven's Rest, the commander continued. It was established by families who believed in the treaty, who trusted that the galactic community would protect those who embraced peace. They were wrong. We were wrong to believe you. His eyes swept the chamber, meeting each representative's gaze in turn. So here's what happens next. You have 72 hours to prove that you actually believe in the principles you forced upon us. 72 hours to show that justice applies equally to all species, not just the ones with convenient politics. 72 hours to demonstrate that human lives matter as much as any other. The ambassador's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, yet somehow more terrifying than any shout. Because if you don't, we'll show you what humanity looks like when we stop trying to be civilized. The mediator's thoughts radiated pure panic. What are you saying? Are you threatening military action? A withdrawal from the treaty? What exactly will you do? The commander smiled, and it was the most frightening expression anyone in that chamber had ever witnessed on a human face. We're going to give you exactly what you gave us. The same level of protection, the same concern for your civilians, the same speed of response when your colonies call for help. We're going to treat your suffering with the same careful deliberation and political consideration that you showed ours. And if we refuse, the overseer demanded, though his crystalline form had dimmed considerably, if we reject your ultimatum? The ambassador walked to the viewing port one final time, looking out at the gathered fleets of the Alliance. When she turned back, her face was calm, almost peaceful. Then you'll discover why humans have a saying, don't mistake patience for weakness. The holographic display flickered one last time, showing something new. A countdown timer, synchronized across every screen in the chamber. 72 hours, ticking down second by second. The clock starts now, the specialist said simply. The council chamber erupted into pandemonium the moment the countdown began. Representatives shouted across dimensional barriers, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that would have been deafening if the chamber hadn't been designed to filter such chaos. Emergency protocols activated automatically, sealing the station and scrambling defensive fleets into protective formations that everyone present now understood were completely useless against phase shift technology. The admiral was already coordinating with his fleet commanders, his aquatic form spinning frantically in its containment sphere as tactical data flooded his consciousness. All vessels to high alert. Begin rotating shield frequencies and prepare for... He stopped, the futility of his orders evident even to him. Prepare for contingencies we don't have countermeasures for. The eldest speaker slumped in his seat, the weight of 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom suddenly feeling inadequate. He had guided the council through wars, plagues, and the near collapse of galactic civilization itself, but nothing in his vast experience had prepared him for an enemy that had studied them for decades while wearing the mask of victims. Tell us what you truly want, not ultimatums or demonstrations. What would satisfy humanity's demand for justice? The ambassador opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, every display in the chamber went dark. The holographic projections vanished, the data streams cut off, and even the emergency lighting flickered. For 3 heartbeats, the most secure facility in known space was plunged into absolute darkness. When the systems came back online, they were no longer under council control. A new figure appeared in the holographic space, but this wasn't a human representative. The scientist's image materialized with crystal clarity, and those who had studied human history felt their biological equivalents of blood run cold. She was young, perhaps 30 standard years, but her eyes carried the terrible clarity of someone who had stared into the fundamental fabric of reality and understood things that were never meant to be understood. "Forgive the interruption," the scientist said, her voice carrying none of the diplomatic polish of the ambassador or the military precision of the commander. She sounded almost apologetic, like someone about to deliver bad news to a friend. "But there's something my colleagues haven't told you yet. Something we discovered that made gravity manipulation possible in the first place." The ambassador's face went pale. The commander's jaw clenched so tightly that several species, with enhanced hearing, could detect his teeth grinding. The specialist's hands moved frantically across controls that no longer responded to her commands. Whatever was happening, the delegation from Earth hadn't planned for it. "Please don't," the ambassador said quietly, but the transmission continued. The scientist smiled sadly. "For 37 years, we've kept our greatest discovery secret, not from the galaxy, but from our own people. The Council needed to know what we found, and since my superiors won't tell you, I will." She gestured, and new data began flooding every system in the chamber, bypassing security that was supposed to be impenetrable. "When we first detected the gravitational anomalies near the outer darkness, we thought we'd found a natural phenomenon, a quirk of physics that could be exploited for technology. We were wrong." The chief scientist was analyzing the incoming data with increasing alarm, her computational processes working overtime to verify what she was seeing. "This can't be accurate. These readings suggest consciousness embedded in spacetime itself, intelligence operating at quantum levels. We're describing first contact," the scientist interrupted. "Real first contact, not with another species that evolved on some distant world, but with something that exists in the spaces between matter and energy. Something that's been watching the galaxy for longer than any of our civilizations have existed." The chamber fell into shocked silence. This was beyond military threats or political maneuvering. This was the kind of revelation that redefined every assumption about reality itself. The mediator's consciousness expanded, trying to process information that violated her species' most fundamental understanding of the universe. "You're saying there's another intelligence? Something we never detected despite millennia of observation." "You never detected it because it exists in gravitational dimensions you don't perceive," the scientist explained with the patience of a teacher addressing students who couldn't grasp a simple concept. "Humans found it by accident, while running experiments your safety protocols would have forbidden. And when we made contact, when we finally learned to communicate with it, do you know what it told us?" The overseer's crystalline form had gone completely dark, his consciousness retreating into protective isolation. The tactical advisor was pulling up every file on human research projects, finding gaps in the data that suddenly seemed far more sinister than simple classification. The security director had stopped even pretending to maintain control, his systems locked out by infiltration, so complete it might as well have been magic. "It told us the truth about the treaty," the scientist continued. "The real reason the galaxy embraced eternal peace 50 years ago. It wasn't philosophical evolution or moral growth. It was fear. Because this entity, this presence in the gravitational substrate of reality, had been slowly waking up, and your most advanced civilizations detected it happening." The ambassador had her hand over her face now, shoulders slumped in defeat. The commander looked like he wanted to strangle the scientist through the holographic projection, but neither of them moved to stop the transmission. Perhaps they couldn't. Perhaps this had been inevitable from the moment humanity decided to issue ultimatums backed by secrets that were never meant to see light. "The treaty was designed to reduce the galaxy's energy footprint," the scientist said, and now her academic tone carried an edge of accusation. "All those restrictions on military activity, all those limits on weapon development and ship construction, they weren't about peace. They were about staying quiet, staying small, hoping the thing in the darkness wouldn't notice your civilizations and decide you were threats worth eliminating." The eldest speaker's voice was barely a whisper. How did you learn this? Because unlike you, we asked it directly, the scientist replied. And it answered. It's been trying to communicate with the galaxy for centuries, but your species interpreted its attempts at contact as natural disasters, solar flares, gravitational anomalies, random quantum fluctuations. You were so terrified of what it might be that you convinced yourselves it was nothing. She pulled up images now, showing patterns in cosmic background radiation that formed something almost like language, gravitational waves that pulsed with mathematical precision, quantum entanglements that spelled out messages in physics itself, and at the center of it all, a question that had been repeating for hundreds of years in a format only humanity had bothered to decode. Why do you hide? The chief scientist was trembling now, her vast intellect struggling with implications that shattered everything she thought she knew. If this entity is real, if it's been conscious and attempting communication, then our entire understanding of the universe is fundamentally flawed. Everything we've built, every theory we've developed, is based on incomplete observations. Welcome to humanity's last 37 years, the commander said bitterly. Now you understand why we stopped trusting your wisdom. You built a civilization on foundations you knew were lies, then forced us to live by rules designed to keep you safe, while pretending it was about moral superiority. The scientist's image flickered, her transmission beginning to destabilize as Council security systems finally mounted an effective countermeasure. But she had time for one more revelation, one more piece of information that would ensure the galaxy would never be the same. The entity isn't hostile, she said quickly, words racing against the static that was consuming her image. It's curious, lonely, desperate for connection with other forms of consciousness. And humanity didn't just learn to communicate with it. We learned to work with it. The phase shift technology, the gravity manipulation, all of it came from partnership with something you were too afraid to acknowledge existed. Her image was almost gone now, breaking apart into digital noise. And 3 days ago, when Haven's Rest was attacked, when 2,000 humans died while the Council debated protocol, the entity felt it happen. It felt humans suffering through the gravitational echoes of dying brains. And for the first time in its existence, the transmission cut off completely, leaving her final words unspoken, but hanging in the air like a sword waiting to fall. The ambassador looked up slowly, meeting the eldest speaker's horrified gaze. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of apocalyptic certainty. For the first time in its existence, the entity asked us what justice means, and we're going to show it. The countdown timer continued its relentless march toward zero, but now everyone in the chamber understood that humanity's 72-hour ultimatum was just the surface of something far larger and more terrifying. The countdown reached 12 hours when the first reports started flooding in. Not reports of attacks or human aggression, but something far stranger. Every major civilization in the galaxy was experiencing the same phenomenon simultaneously. Gravitational fluctuations that their instruments could detect, but not explain. Waves of force that passed through shields and armor as if they weren't there, touching nothing physical, but leaving every sentient being who experienced them fundamentally changed. The mediator was the first to understand what was happening. Her species existed partially in higher dimensional spaces, which made them sensitive to things others couldn't perceive. When the wave passed through her, she gasped in a way her kind hadn't done in millions of years. "It's showing us," she whispered, her consciousness bleeding awe and terror in equal measure. "The entity. It's letting us feel what it feels. Every death, every act of violence, every moment of suffering across the entire galaxy. We're experiencing reality the way it does." Throughout the council chamber, representatives began to react as the gravitational echoes reached them. The overseer's crystalline form resonated with frequencies that translated to screaming. The admiral clutched his containment sphere as phantom sensations of drowning flooded his consciousness. The eldest speaker aged 1,000 years in seconds as he felt the accumulated weight of every life lost while he debated protocol and procedure. And they all felt Haven's Rest die. 2,000 human minds crying out in terror and pain, their final moments preserved in gravitational memory, like scars on the fabric of space itself. They felt the children who called for parents that couldn't save them, They felt the colonists who trusted the treaty to protect them watching their hopes burn with their homes. They felt the desperate transmissions to the council that were received, logged, and filed away as lower priority items. "Make it stop," the overseer pleaded, his form flickering like a candle in wind. "Please make it stop." The commander's voice was hard as iron. "You wanted to understand humanity's anger? Now you understand. This is what we've been living with. This is what you dismissed as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of peace. The entity remembers every death in its gravitational field, and it's been remembering human suffering for 50 years, while you did nothing." The chief scientist was weeping, her vast intellect overwhelmed by emotions her species had engineered out of themselves generations ago. "We didn't know. We couldn't perceive it. How could we act on suffering we couldn't feel?" "You could have listened," the ambassador said simply. "Every time we told you our people were dying. Every time we brought evidence of treaty violations. Every time we begged for the protection you promised. You didn't need to feel our pain to acknowledge it was real." The gravitational waves intensified, and suddenly every being in the chamber was experiencing something new. Hope. Specifically, human hope. The desperate, stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars and genocides. The bone-deep conviction that tomorrow could be better if you were willing to fight for it. The exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying decision to keep trying even when failure seemed certain. It was overwhelming. It was beautiful. It was more powerful than any weapon humanity had revealed. The tactical advisor understood first, because military minds recognize turning points. "You're not here to threaten us," he said slowly, revelation dawning in his voice. "You never were. This entire demonstration, the weapons, the ultimatum, even exposing the entity. You're trying to make us feel what you feel. You're teaching us empathy through the only language we'd actually understand." The specialist nodded, and for the first time since the humans entered the chamber, she smiled. "The entity asked us what justice means. We told it that justice is when everyone feels everyone else's pain, when suffering can't be ignored because it's happening to someone else, when protection applies equally because we're all equally real." She gestured at the assembled council, many of whom were still reeling from the gravitational echoes. "You needed to feel what you'd been dismissing as statistics and reports. You needed to understand that human lives aren't numbers in diplomatic calculations." "But the weapons," the security director managed to say through the emotional overload his systems were experiencing. "The phase shift technology, the intelligence networks, the countdown. Those are real threats." "They are," the commander agreed, "and they'll remain real as long as necessary. But they're not the point. The point is that we could have used them at any time in the last 37 years. We could have taken revenge, destroyed those who attacked us, burned our pain into the galaxy until everyone felt it. But we didn't, because the entity taught us something your civilizations forgot." The eldest speaker looked up, gravitational tears streaming down his ancient face. "What did it teach you?" "That power, without restraint, is just violence," the ambassador said softly. "That justice isn't about making others suffer the way you suffered. It's about making sure no one has to suffer that way again. The entity has existed for eons, with more power than all our civilizations combined, and it never once used that power to harm. It waited. It watched. It hoped that eventually someone would learn to listen." The countdown reached 6 hours, and the chamber systems finally came back under council control. The scientists' unauthorized transmission had ended, but the damage, or perhaps the healing, was already done. Every representative present had felt things they couldn't unfeel, understood truths they couldn't unlearn. The mediator's voice was steady now, transformed by what she'd experienced. "What happens when the countdown reaches 0? If we've learned what you wanted to teach us, if we understand now, what comes next?" The commander exchanged glances with the ambassador. Something passed between them, a decision that had clearly been debated long before they entered this chamber. When he spoke, his words carried weight that bent the very air. "When the countdown reaches 0, every civilization in the galaxy will experience what you just felt. Not just your leaders or diplomats, but every being capable of consciousness. Billions of minds, all simultaneously understanding what the entity understands, all feeling what it means to ignore suffering because it's not happening to you. The implications crashed through the chamber like a tidal wave. It wasn't a military strike or political maneuvering. It was something far more fundamental. Humanity was about to force the entire galaxy to evolve empathy, whether they wanted to or not. You can't, the overseer protested weakly. The psychological trauma alone would destabilize entire civilizations. Societies built on hierarchies of suffering would collapse overnight. It would be chaos. It would be justice, the specialist corrected. And maybe chaos is what you need. Maybe comfortable civilizations that can ignore atrocity because it's not happening to them deserve to be uncomfortable for a while. The Admiral was accessing military protocols frantically, searching for any response to a threat that existed in gravitational dimensions his weapons couldn't touch. This is an attack. Calling it education doesn't change that you're forcibly altering the consciousness of every being in known space. Is it an attack when a parent teaches a child that hurting others is wrong? The ambassador asked. Is it violence when someone forces you to see truth you'd rather ignore? You had 50 years to learn this lesson voluntarily. You chose not to. So now the entity and humanity together are making sure you can't keep choosing ignorance. The countdown ticked down. 5 hours. 4. 3. The chief scientist was running calculations that terrified her. The phase alignment required to generate gravitational waves across this much space simultaneously. The precision needed to touch consciousness without damaging neural structures. This isn't just advanced technology. This is reality engineering at scales that shouldn't be possible. Shouldn't be possible for you, the commander said. But then, you gave up trying the impossible the moment it became inconvenient. Humans don't have that luxury. We spent 50 years being told our survival wasn't worth disrupting galactic peace. So we learned to do the impossible quietly. The eldest speaker stood slowly, his ancient form trembling with effort and emotion. And if we agree now, if we commit to genuine justice, to protecting all species equally, to honoring the treaty in spirit and not just letter, will you stop the countdown? The ambassador looked at him for a long moment, and something in her eyes spoke of calculations made long ago. No, she said finally, because we don't trust promises anymore. We trusted the treaty and watched it mean nothing when we needed it. We trusted the council and learned that justice is always complicated when it's our blood being spilled. Words aren't enough. The galaxy needs to feel what they've been ignoring before they can understand why it matters. 2 hours. The council chamber had gone silent. Every representative was accessing communications with their home worlds, trying to prepare their people for something that couldn't be prepared for, trying to explain that in less than 2 hours, everything would change. The implications settled over the chamber like starlight. Every civilization in the galaxy was now part of something larger than themselves, connected through bonds that couldn't be severed because they existed in the fundamental structure of reality. The entity hadn't invaded their consciousness. It had welcomed them into a consciousness that had always been there, waiting for them to evolve enough to perceive it. The ambassador turned back to face the council, and her expression was softer now, the hard edges worn away by shared experience. The weapons humanity built, the technology we developed, the intelligence networks we established, they're all still real. We're not giving them up, but we don't need them the way we thought we would. Because now you understand. You can't unfeel what you felt. You can't go back to ignoring suffering because it's not yours. The tactical advisor nodded slowly, understanding military realities, even in the midst of transformation. The strategic balance has shifted, but not the way anyone expected. Not through superior weapons or tactical advantage, but through making warfare psychologically impossible for anyone who's experienced this connection. Some will still try, the specialist warned. There are always beings who can shut off their empathy, who can compartmentalize and rationalize. The galaxy isn't suddenly perfect. No, the mediator agreed. But it's better. We're better. And now when someone tries to justify atrocity, they'll have to do it while feeling the echoes of what they're causing. Some will still choose cruelty, but they'll have to choose it consciously, knowing exactly what they're doing. The eldest speaker finally stood, his ancient form somehow appearing both older and younger than before. What happens now? To the treaty? To the council? To the structure of galactic civilization? The commander smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, it reached his eyes. That's up to all of you. Humanity isn't interested in ruling the galaxy or dictating terms. We just wanted justice. Real justice. Not the kind that gets debated while people die. Now that everyone can feel what justice means, you'll figure out the details yourselves. The countdown display had gone dark, replaced by something new. A gravitational map, showing the connections between every conscious being in known space, a web of light and awareness that pulsed with shared experience. At its center was Earth, not because humans had conquered or dominated, but because they'd been the first species brave enough or desperate enough to reach out to the entity and ask it to teach them what connection meant. The ambassador gathered her delegation, preparing to leave a council chamber that would never be the same. We'll be going now. We have colonies to rebuild and families to mourn. Haven's Rest will be remembered, not as the place where humanity broke its silence, but as the place where the galaxy learned to listen. As the humans departed, the mediator called out one final question. What if we fail? What if even with this connection, we still can't build the just civilization you're hoping for? The commander paused in the doorway, looking back with eyes that had seen too much suffering, but somehow still held hope. Then we'll fail together, feeling each other's disappointment instead of just our own. But I don't think we'll fail, because for the first time in history, the galaxy isn't going to be comfortable ignoring pain that isn't theirs, and discomfort is where change begins. The doors closed behind them, and across a million worlds, beings who had been strangers yesterday woke up knowing they would never truly be alone again. The entity's presence settled into consciousness, like a permanent reminder that every action rippled through reality in ways that couldn't be unseen. It wasn't paradise, and it wasn't peace in the way the old treaty had imagined peace. It was something harder and more real, a galaxy learning that true civilization meant carrying each other's burdens and refusing to let anyone suffer alone. And somewhere between the stars, in dimensions of gravity and thought, the entity that had waited so long for companions finally rested, no longer alone in the vast darkness, forever connected to the children it had helped evolve into something greater than they'd been before. The countdown reached 0, and across a million worlds, every being capable of thought suddenly felt everything, and reality itself held its breath to see what would happen when isolation finally ended and the galaxy learned to feel as one. Because somewhere in the darkness between stars, in dimensions of gravity and space-time that conventional physics couldn't touch, something ancient and powerful had finally found allies who spoke its language, and together they were about to teach the galaxy what happened when you built civilization on foundations of cowardice and called it peace. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, hidden in the shadow of a dying sun, the real demonstration of human capability was already powering up, waiting to show the galaxy exactly what happened when humanity stopped holding back and started holding grudges. DB asking what else we've discovered in 37 years of secret research. You should be wondering what other impossibilities we've made routine. You should be considering what humanity is capable of when you stop holding us back. Outside the chamber, the assembled fleets of the Galactic Alliance suddenly seemed vulnerable and exposed, their mighty vessels reduced to targets, waiting for weapons they couldn't detect. Inside the chamber, the calculations were already being made. If humanity could hide this, what else might they have concealed? But the true horror hadn't yet revealed itself, because what the Council didn't know was that gravity manipulation was only the beginning, and the real message Earth wanted to send was still waiting in the shadows of space, counting down to a demonstration that would redefine what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had forgotten